Today we have a special guest, Sara Uckelman, the professor of logic in the Department of Philosophy at Durham University. Sara is also known as Dr. Logic and has her own YouTube channel, Dr. Logic. You can actually watch if you click here, the link here, and also in the description box. Sara has a very curious blog where she writes about navigating academia as a neurodivergent. And I also put the link to the blog at the description box, so you check it out. It's a very interesting read. And today we'll talk about the navigating academia as a neurodivergent, especially about writing essays, theses, these things that usually trouble every student, but I think especially students with ADHD and autism. Okay, so Sara, I'm really happy to see you here, even if we talk on Zoom and not in person. And the first question that I would like to ask is just like my personal curiosity. How you, from your own experience, how did you experience these essays, this kind of written works that are they're really very often overestimated in academia, this kind of this written performance. How did you encounter it for the first time, and how did you deal with them? How did you manage to deal with them,
Yeah.
actually?
Oh, well, first of all, thank you so much for having me, Sophia. It's really fun to have a chance to talk about these things and to kind of share some of my own experiences, because one thing that I have found is I have benefited so much from hearing about other people's experiences. So it's always kind of turn and turn about. I have I have always been a writer. Like, one of my earliest kind of conceptions of myself is like, who am I? Or what am I going to be when I grow up? I was going to be a writer. I started writing short stories when I was 4, wrote them all through childhood, all the way up. Because I had an atypical education, I was taught at home in the US, all the
Mm.
way from kindergarten up through the end of high school. So I had various essays and assignments and things, but a lot of times they were very self-directed, open structure. I got to choose my topics.
Mm.
There weren't fixed lengths or fixed styles, so I could be creative and I could explore things. And so when I got to university, and all of a sudden there were deadlines and much more rigid structures and some amount of freedom in topics, but often it's like you've got to be writing on this particular novel or this particular
Mm.
philosophical question. Uh, in a sense, I didn't struggle too much for most of my undergrad, in part because this process of writing was so novel that it was like fun. It's like, here's a new challenge. At
Mm.
the time, I didn't feel like I struggled very much. In retrospect, I look back at the number of essays that I wrote the day before they were due, and for me, this was fine. I got good marks. I enjoyed doing it. The process worked well. But I would look around at like my classmates and stuff who would be starting their essays like 2 weeks in advance, writing outlines and drafts. And I'm like, I don't quite understand what they are doing or how this works. And because my process worked for me, I didn't really care. And that kind of continued on through graduate school. Essentially, like, graduate school is, in some respects, the perfect situation for a neurodivergent person, because it's basically like saying, here, take 4 years to hyper focus on your favorite special interest and write things about it. This was amazing. There were also, again, not very many deadlines. Sometimes it was a bit difficult to actually figure out like what to be doing without the pressure of a deadline. So that was something that I had to learn how to navigate. But all in all, I've actually found the writing side of things. It's always been something I've enjoyed and I've been good at. It's then, on the kind of the academic side of things, it's fitting that into the required structures, where it's like, you've got to write a paper of this length or of this style or on this topic or by this date. That's a bit more tricky.
Yeah, good. Yeah, thank you. That's interesting. Actually, deadlines. I mean, everyone struggles with deadlines, but I think I know that the ADHD people have a special feeling of time, and deadlines are kind of a very strange thing for people with ADHD. So you mentioned that you worked on your essay a day before, and it was okay for you. Did you have troubles to meet them, or it wasn't the case at all?
I yeah. So for a lot of like, I guess as a student, not so much, because often that was like the only kind of competing things that I had. I just had coursework, essays and homeworks,
Mm.
and my part-time job. And those were the only things that I needed to pay attention to. The deadlines didn't tend to overlap. And so it was just a series of deadlines. And so whichever was the next task, I would work to that one. And I'm sure that people with ADHD will recognize kind of the fact that like without a deadline, a task doesn't really exist. And this is something that has actually been made things difficult in balancing the entire academic life, where it's not just kind of going to class and writing assignments, but you've got a whole bunch of competing kind of calls on your time and attention.
Yeah.
And sometimes I'll get emails from colleagues who are trying to be helpful and accommodating and be like, oh, just get me the information whenever you can. And I have to write back and say, if you don't give me a deadline, I will be writing you back in 5 years, because that is the next time that I will have time. Like, this isn't a real task until you tell me when you need the information. And then I can start building it into like my calendar of deadlines. But even so, it does mean that I am living deadline to deadline. And as academic projects get more complex, the less possible it is to just do them the day before or the night before or even the week
Mhm.
before. Sometimes big research projects just take more time. And
Yeah.
and also, if you're stacking your deadlines one right after another, it takes one thing to go wrong and your entire schedule is messed up and ruined. And then you get caught in this kind of ADHD failure loop where you're like, well, if
Mm.
I couldn't meet that deadline and it screwed up that deadline and now that deadline is gone, it's like, why even bother trying to do anything? Because none of it is ever going to work ever.
Mm.
You understand kind of the
Yeah.
catastrophizing that can happen.
Yeah. Goodness. Yeah. I've just thought something actually the big projects like thesis, for instance, especially if it's a master thesis that requires really more attention, more time for that.
Mm-hmm.
What we can do to really work on that project and not on something else, like smaller deadlines that are. I have the same trouble now. Just simply, I have a big project that I should work, but I also have a small projects that have these pressing deadlines, and I kind of meeting them, but not the
Not the
big
big,
one. But we eventually have to write this
yep.
thesis, right? What
So
to do, how to organize the work here?
I am probably the wrong person to ask about
Okay.
this, because in the final months of finishing up my PhD thesis, where I was like really intensely writing, doing lots of different chapters, I also, so my PhD was on modal logic in the Middle Ages, looking at various medieval texts, looking at the logical developments in them, and using the tools of contemporary mathematical and modal logic to try to make sense of it. While I was doing that, I also simultaneously wrote a draft on Middle English nicknames in the London lay subsidy rolls between 1292 and 1312. So I am the wrong person to ask about how to pay attention to a big task, because the way that I did that was essentially by having two big tasks that I ran simultaneously. But there's something that I read on the internet many years, like almost 20 years ago, which resonated with me a lot at the time and is another one of those things in retrospect you look at, it's like, oh yes, this is classic ADHD productivity harnessing. It's called structured procrastination. And the idea is that you can often be very effective by having lots of different tasks on hand, so that as soon as one of them isn't working very well, you can switch and work on another one, so that you're still being productive, even if maybe not exactly on the thing you're supposed to be working on. And in my particular thesis work, I found this something that I did even just within the thesis itself, because the nature of the work that I was doing meant sometimes I'm like trying to translate a medieval manuscript from Latin into English. And sometimes I'm like trying to prove something in, prove a logical theorem. And like whenever one of those started being difficult, whenever I was running into problems, it always meant that I could set that aside and I could move back to the other. And it was a very different type of task that I could probably make some progress on. So like if the translation wasn't going well, there was probably some logic I could do. And when I ran into a wall with doing the logic, there was probably some sort of translation work that I could go back to. And having this cyclical sort of fashion worked really well in like the thesis writing process. The bit of the danger that I've come to in kind of expanding this to like all very like, multiple different academic projects, grant deadlines, marking student homeworks, preparing for meetings and things, is that it can be easy to just skip over the things that need to be done, be like, oh, I'm just going to work on this other project instead. And yeah, I don't really have an answer for how to deal with that. I guess it just helps to recognize that this is what's happening sometimes.
Yeah. And I really like this idea that you need to have a couple of different projects to switch in between them. Yeah, because I think it helps. It really helps if you're stuck in one of them. If you're just stuck in sometimes just work became boring and it happens, and you need to deal with this boredom. And also I wonder actually how we can deal with boredom in academia, like not like in general, but in relation to essay assignments that are not sometimes something that we like to write about, because sometimes they just out of the scope of the
You've
interest, right?
got a
So it's
requirement to write
yeah,
something on this.
yeah. What to do if it's not stimulating enough? It's not interesting enough.
So I, particularly when I was, kind of in the first years of my undergrad, when I had, taken a lot more kind of general education classes, things that weren't specific to my particular interests, having to write papers like that, I ended up writing a number of papers where I essentially issued myself really silly challenges in writing the paper. So one paper I wrote, it was a relatively short one. It had 26 sentences in it, and each sentence started with the successive letter of the alphabet. So the first sentence started with A, the second with B, the second with C. I once wrote an essay on the American poet Anne Bradstreet, and the first letters of all of the sentences in that essay spelled out Anne Bradstreet over and over. And that sort of thing was, it was enough, it was enough of a challenge that it kept me going, but it also wasn't kind of overt enough that it impacted on my ability to write a good essay. I mean, when you're doing Anne Bradstreet, you do realize how few words to start sentences there are that begin with E, and how often you would like to start a sentence with T. But those were kind of little linguistic things that I could get around. The other thing that I do is I fully lean into rewarding myself. So you've written 400 words, go you, stop, read a chapter of whatever novel you're watching, watch a 20-minute TV show, have a couple of M&Ms, whatever it is that I need in order to get myself motivated to go back and do the next bit. And something I've found is like the 400 word target has been just transformative for me. I tried, it was maybe like 6 or 7 years ago. I kind of signed up to commit to writing 5 days out of every 7. So it wasn't like every weekday or or anything like that, or 7 days a week. You need to have flex to be able to have a day that it doesn't work. But 5 days out of every 7, I had a target of 500 words. And almost immediately on day 1, I was like, 500 words is a lot of words. I can't do this. And then I was like, but wait, Sarah, you chose this goal for yourself. You can change it. Why not go for 400 words? And all of a sudden, 400 words was manageable. You can do 400 words in like 20 minutes. And the brilliant thing about 400 words is that quite often you actually write like 425 or 460 or 550. Or sometimes you sit down to write 400 words and you turn around and you've written 1,000. So this sort of kind of reasonable targets, extra mental challenges, and rewards. This is basically how the vast majority of all of my academic work has been written.
Rewards. Yeah, I like rewards actually. I just recently discovered the power of rewards.
Yes.
Yeah, they can't be anything. So it's not necessarily to buy expensive things or
Yeah.
to eat sweets all the time. It may be every type of stuff that just helps us
It could be
going
a
on.
10-minute walk outside around the block
Yes,
in the
yes,
sunshine.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. Why not? Why not? Yeah. The question that bothers me actually, and not only me, but also the people who follow my channel, some of the followers ask the question about the procrastination, and especially what to do if the task, especially thesis, this big task, they look very, scary because you never actually done this thing before, and so what we can do, because we tend to really push it to the last moment or to the last couple of weeks to write it down. And what can we do in this scary situation?
Yeah. So I supervise a number of undergraduate theses every year. And so these are 12,000 words on a topic of the student's choosing. And this is coming on the back of most people at this point, the max that they've ever written on an essay is 2,500 to 3,000 words. So 12,000 all of a sudden seems like a lot. So one thing that I recommend is don't think of it as 12,000 words. Think of it as 4 3,000 word essays. Not only because that puts it into like an achievable category, because if you've already written a 3,000 word essay before, then you know this is a skill that you have. You can figure out how to do it again. But also in terms of structuring a thesis, it's a good way of thinking about how to collect your ideas and how to combine them and how to form them. If you want to have, say, roughly 1,500 words for introduction and motivation, 3,000 word chapters, and 1,500 words for conclusion, wrapping things up. Now, every thesis is going to be different. You might have a 500 word introduction. You might have 4 chapters. You might have an introduction that is not separate from the first chapter. But just kind of having that broad sort of structure is useful, because then instead of having this big undirected project, you've got it. Essentially, I talk to my students in terms of like buckets. You've got different buckets for your ideas, and each one of these buckets is probably going to become a chapter. So just start collecting the ideas and asking yourself, if I have 3 buckets, which of these buckets do these ideas go in? And then maybe you find you've got a 4th bucket for extra stuff. Whenever I'm writing a paper, I always have a section at the end, which is just entitled notes. And I put quotes from articles that I'm reading, questions that I've thought of, sentences that are kind of like playing around in my head, but I don't know where they're going to fit or if they're going to fit. I just put them all in there so that I've always got it. And then sometimes it becomes another chapter. Sometimes none of it ends up in the final version. Sometimes it just gets spread out over what I already have. So that's one thing, kind of breaking it down into smaller concrete tasks. The other is the 400 words thing. So if you think I gotta write 12,000 words, then that seems almost impossible. But if you think I've got to write 400 words, or I have to write 12,000 words in 400 word chunks, that's 30 chunks. If you do it 5 days out of every 7, that's 6 weeks. Which is, if you've been given an entire year to write a dissertation, 2 20-week terms, plus breaks, plus the fact that, at least in my department, they're not due until the 3rd term. Essentially, like 6 weeks of 5 days of 400 words, all of a sudden becomes so much easier. And, sometimes you're not going to be motivated until the deadline is closer. And I do tell some of my students, it's like, you might be in a position where you just aren't able to write until the deadline is quite close. That's fine, so long as you recognize that that's what's happening and you have a plan, so that when you get, say, 4 weeks out from the deadline, you look at how much you've written, you look at how much you have to write, you do the math, and you say, okay, I now have to do 400 words a day, 700 words a day, whatever it is. And then you've got your kind of daily targets that you can achieve, and you get the dopamine hits of achieving them, but it's still in this sort of manageable sense. The last thing that I advise, and this is, again, for like bigger projects like theses, where there's an element of personal choice. So your thesis topic is probably something that you are invested in. I always tell my students, start off by writing the bit that explains what is the topic, what are the interesting things about it, and why are you interested in it? Why did you choose to write your thesis on this rather than something else? And sometimes that chunk, that 400 or 500 words, never ends up in the thesis at all. But if I just tell my students, sit down and tell me what the problem is and why you are interested in it, and then by implication, I will also be interested in it, that is a good priming activity that then gets them in a position where, like, oh, okay, I now know how to begin the framing of what I'm doing. And as soon as you no longer have the blank document, everything becomes easier.
Yeah, exactly. This is something that writers call the fear of blank paper, or something like that. So I heard this type of expression. Yeah, it's very peculiar. Yeah, and I like these ideas that we don't really need to start with something like introduction, like
I
starting
always
with
tell my students,
the beginning.
the last thing that you write in an essay, in a thesis, whatever, is the introduction.
Yeah.
Because at least for most people, you don't know what you're going to say until you've actually said it.
Yeah.
And so once you have said it, then you can go back and you can write an introduction that sets up the problem, says what you're going to say, gives the structure, and nothing impresses a journal referee or a PhD examiner or the second marker on your dissertation than having an introduction that tells you what's going to happen in the thesis, and then the thesis does that. That is such a powerful thing to do, but it's so easy if you just write the introduction last.
Yeah. It's a great thing. I discovered it when I wrote my, I think I wrote my PhD. It wasn't even a research master or something. So I really I followed that strange advice that was given to me as an undergrad, when I was an undergrad, just to start with relevance of your project, discussing the research questions and things like that. I just writing this boring introduction thing, and I did it for months. I think just polishing and polishing and polishing, and I ended up like really writing the final chapters during a couple of weeks before the deadline. So it was a scary experience, because it just I kept polishing things that actually shouldn't been polished at all. And so I want to actually, if you can if there is something that you certainly never would advise to a neurodivergent student to how to like some tasks, some not tasks, let's say, things that are usually advised
Yeah,
to everyone, how to write essays or thesis, what you can't really and would never be advising to a neurodivergent.
I've definitely got something. If you go to like essay writing workshops or writing centers, or even like if you have essay-based exams and you go and you get guidance on this, a lot of times the advice that you get is to start with an outline, write an outline, and then maybe put some bullet points into your outline, and then take those bullet points and kind of expand on them, turn them into sentences, turn them into paragraphs, make each of your sections, turn them into sections, and then all of a sudden you have a chapter or an essay or something. I find this advice absolutely baffling. I have had students who can do this, and watching it happen in drafts that I get from them, it's like magic, because I can't do this. Because writing an outline in advance assumes that you already know what you're going to say. And this is not how I write. It's not how I do research. Very much, I start with some idea. Maybe it's a question, maybe I'm looking at a particular text and I want to start figuring out what is in the text. But the process of answering the question or figuring out what's in the text I'm analyzing is part and parcel with my process of writing. So I don't know what I'm going to say in a paper until I have said it. The process of writing for me is the process of discovery, and it even shapes my reading. So another piece of advice that students are often given is like, go out, find your relevant reading, read it all, take your notes, and then write your paper. And I get students who come to me and they're like, I feel like my reading is undirected, or I feel like I don't know when to stop reading, or I feel like all I'm doing is reading, but I don't know what to say. And with those sorts of people who are in that situation, I tell them, stop, take a step back, start writing, because writing will tell you what it is that you need to know. You'll get to a point and be like, I need to know way more about 16th century Puritanism than I ever thought that I would need to know. And I didn't know that I needed to know this before I started writing on this particular late 17th century text. And then you go off and you do your reading to answer certain questions or to provide certain background information or to get the particular technical details that you need. So the look of relief on students' faces when I tell them that, particularly if you are neurodivergent, you will never be able to do the outlining in advance. And this isn't a moral failing. This isn't a mark of being a bad writer or anything. It just means that your process of discovery is different. Write your paper and then figure out what the outline needs to be. Because an outline type process, I think, is really important for understanding the structure. And there's two kind of things that I recommend. One is a process called reverse outlining. And if you just, if you go into Google, you type in reverse outlining, the University of Wisconsin creative writing page has a really good outline of what it is. But basically, you take something that you've already written and you go through it paragraph by paragraph, and you ask, what is the question that is being answered here? Is there just one question, or are there 2 points? Are they in the right order? And kind of condensing everything down into like a little summary makes it a lot easier to figure out what order things should be in. The other thing that I do is often if I'm drafting a paper, I'll be giving talks on it at workshops or colloquia or in progress sessions. And the process of making slides from like a 75% written draft very frequently is what kind of tells me, oh, this is the order the information needs to be in, because if I'm going to be talking about it to somebody, they need to know this before they need to know this. So it's such a useful thing. I'll have kind of the brain dump draft, I'll give a talk, it gets turned into slides, and then I essentially take the slides and pull it back into the draft, and then I have my structure.
Yeah, I discovered something very similar that also relates to the public presentations. Then I'm preparing my presentation, just not necessarily actually even with the PowerPoint, maybe just something that I'm going to say. I understand that these people don't know this, and then they don't know that. So I have to say
Yep.
this first and that next, and clarify this point and another point. So it kind of, I think maybe it's about really imagining your audience that helps here, like
Yeah.
really imagining who will read it or who will listen to it. So, and if these people they are familiar with these topics or not, so it's kind of about the reader perspective, something. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think it helps. Yeah.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, I'm in a philosophy department. And so when I am advising students writing their final year dissertations, these are generally marked by the supervisor who knows the student and then marked anonymously by another member of staff. And so what I tell my students is write for somebody, you can assume that they are, philosophically expertly trained. They've got all of the skills. They can understand complex arguments, all of this. They are philosophically very astute, but dumb. Assume that they don't actually know anything, because you never know, is the second person marking your thesis going to be also an expert in your area, or because of how marking allocations go, it could be somebody who, like, I have marked essays on aesthetics and on ethics. I know very little about these fields. And so this is just a way to kind of remind students, it's like every time you introduce a technical term, even if you are familiar with it because you've been steeped in ethics, you've been doing ethics all of these years, maybe the philosopher you're talking to, for whatever reason, doesn't know what utilitarianism is. So just explain it. And this kind of framing of your audience as somebody who's philosophically very clever, but kind of contentfully very ignorant, is a useful thing. And this propagates on in terms of other things that you might write later on in your academic career. When I was an early graduate student, I remember struggling a bit. Like, I had ideas, but like writing a paper into a void was really hard. And at one point, I had some ideas, and I was talking to my supervisor, and he's like, "Oh, what are you planning to write that paper for?" And I was like, "Well, what do you mean? I was just going to write a paper." And he's like, "What do you mean? Aren't you planning to like present it or publish it?" And I'm like, "What do you?" It was this really weird kind of like culture clash of like what I thought I was doing and what he thought, because I was coming from a philosophy background and he's very much in the mathematics and sciences background. And what I learned from this is like, oh, every time I write a paper, I need to be writing it for something. I have a particular journal in mind. I have a particular conference I'm submitting it for. And that makes it so much easier to write because, as you say, you know who your audience is. You know what kinds of things you can assume. You know what kinds of structures are going to be expected. Can I put in long discursive footnotes because I'm writing to historians? Or do the footnotes get kept to a minimum because I'm writing to logicians?
Yeah, okay. So historians like footnotes.
Oh, historians
Yeah,
love.
they do like they do like
They want all
footnotes.
their bibliographic
Yeah,
information in the footnote. They want
yeah,
all of the, yeah. It's very
yeah,
different sort of styles depending on who you're writing
yeah,
for.
exactly, exactly. I also wonder, is there anything like your like life-saving advice that you received? You mentioned some of them already, but
Yeah.
maybe there is something that you would like to share with others, like with my followers, with my followers, the followers of my channel, just to save them their life and time and energy in essay writing and thesis writing.
I guess I'm giving a bunch of kind of practical advice. And one thing I will say is